Before lines were drawn on maps, Africa already named herself. Long before the treaties, before the flags, before the sound of foreign tongues divided her rivers and mountains, the continent was already whole, already known to its children by names older than memory. Every hill, every river, every plain had a name whispered through generations, each syllable carrying spirit, ancestry, and story. Africa's geography was not a blank waiting to be filled. It was a living poem written in languages that pulsed with life. Before the scramble for Africa, the lands we now call Nigeria, Ghana, and Mali did not exist as they do today. They were not lines on a colonial map. They were civilizations, constellations of kingdoms and clans, bound together by trade, kinship, and sacred geography. In those days, names were not mere labels. They were meanings, promises, and identities. The word Nigeria had not yet been imagined, but Ile Omo Oduduwa was already spoken among the Yoruba, Ala Igbo among the Igbo, Ailu Edo among the Edo, each a self-contained world. Ghana was not yet a republic. It was Wagadu, the land of kings. Mali was not a border. It was Mandin, a spirit of light and river. Modern nations are young, but the civilizations that birthed them are ancient. Long before the idea of a nation, Africa knew belonging through lineage, through the soil, through shared symbols. Borders were not drawn in ink, they were sung into being. The idea of ownership was not measured by land, but by relationship. Who your ancestors were, what river you crossed, what sky you prayed under. When the world changed, these names were buried beneath treaties and textbooks. The colonial project didn't just steal land, it renamed it, reshaping how Africans saw themselves. But the memory of those names never died. It lingered in songs, in praise poetry, in rituals spoken quietly at dusk. Before the world changed, West Africa was already a universe of names, rivers, and memory. The challenge before us now is to listen, to remember what our lands were called before they were told what to be. So we ask, what were the names before the names? Long before the world came to know the word Ghana, there was Wagadu, the land of kings and gold, the empire that shimmered at the crossroads of desert and savanna. To its people, Wagadu was not just a kingdom. It was a sacred order, a civilization that understood wealth as both material and spiritual. The name Wagadu carried many meanings, among them land of gold and kingdom of kings. It spoke of abundance, not only in gold dust and ivory, but in wisdom, justice, and divine harmony. Yet here lies a forgotten truth. Ghana was never the land's original name. It was the title of its rulers, a word meaning warrior king, a symbol of authority and divine right. The Arab historians who came to record the empire heard its people speak reverently of their sovereign, the Ghana, and mistook the title for the land itself. So the kingdom of Wagadu became known to the outside world as the Empire of Ghana, a linguistic error that transformed into legend. At its height, the capital city of Kumbi Saleh stood as one of the wealthiest metropolises in the world, a city where gold dust was weighed in markets. Scholars debated on the desert winds, and caravans carried treasures across the Sahara to the Mediterranean. But Kumbi Saleh was more than a trading hub. It was a city of divine rule. Its architecture followed spiritual geometry. Twin cities divided by faith and function, where the ruler's compound and the merchant's quarters coexisted under one sun. The Ghana's palace, vast and walled, was both temple and throne, a meeting point between earth and heaven. To foreign eyes, Wagadu seemed mythical, a place so rich it was said that even its dogs wore gold collars. But beneath the splendor lay something deeper, a philosophy of balance. The gold of the earth was never just wealth to be hoarded. It was a sacred element, a gift entrusted to the king by the ancestors. The ruler, the Ghana, held gold not as a possession, but as a covenant. In this understanding, Wagadu became not just a kingdom of gold, but a kingdom of meaning. When the empire eventually waned, swallowed by the tides of time, trade shifts, and new rising powers, its name endured as memory. Centuries later, when the British colony called the Gold Coast stood on the brink of independence, a visionary leader, Kwame Nkrumah, sought a name that could carry the spirit of African pride into the modern age. He did not invent a new name. He reached back into time and reclaimed one that already carried power. In 1957, as drums thundered and flags were raised, the Gold Coast became Ghana, not the old Wagadu itself, but an heir to its legacy. The title that once belonged to kings now belonged to a people. What had been misheard by outsiders was now repurposed by descendants as a declaration. We remember who we are. The choice was deliberate and poetic. It was an act of restoration, a gesture that bridged the ancient and the modern, the empire and the republic, the crown and the citizen. In reclaiming Ghana, Africa spoke to itself, saying, "The name has come home." In that moment, the cycle turned. Wagadu, the land of gold, the realm of divine kingship, rose again, not as empire but as memory resurrected. The story of Ghana reminds us that a name, once taken, can always return. And when it does, it carries the sound of ancestors calling across centuries, whispering, "The name returned home."
There are rivers that carry water, and then there are rivers that carry civilizations. In West Africa, the Niger River was more than a life source. It was a spine of power, memory, and meaning. Along its bends rose two of the most majestic empires the continent has ever known, Mali and Songhai. These were not just political entities, they were worlds of light, woven with law, language, and learning. And their names, like their legacies, tell us everything. The name Mali is thought to come from Mandin or Malika, with layered meanings, the place where the king resides or where the hippo dwells. In African cosmology, the hippo is a creature of strength, wisdom, and presence, grounded in water yet able to command land. This dual nature mirrored Mali's spirit, grounded in ancestry but fluid in ambition. It was an empire built not on war alone, but on the steady current of culture and the sacred weight of leadership. At the center of Mali's power stood the cities of Niani and later Timbuktu, hubs where gold and grain passed hands, but also where ideas took root and soared. Under the rule of legendary kings like Sundiata Keita and Mansa Musa, Mali became the luminous heart of a golden age. Yet Mali's true wealth was not what glittered in markets, but what echoed in minds. Mansa Musa's Hajj to Mecca stunned the world with the displays of gold. But behind the spectacle was a scholar king who returned with architects, astronomers, and scribes. He understood what so many overlooked. Knowledge was Africa's first gold. The spiritual backbone of the Mali Empire was the Manden Charter, one of the world's oldest declarations of human rights. Known in oral tradition as the Kurukan Fuga, it was proclaimed in the 13th century after Sundiata's victory at the Battle of Kirina. The charter declared that every human life was sacred, that freedom and dignity were divine rights, and that peace was to be pursued not just through treaties, but through truth. Long before the Enlightenment, before any so-called universal declaration, Mali had already spoken these truths aloud. As Mali's light waned, another power rose downstream, Songhai. Where Mali was grounded in land and law, Songhai surged with energy, expansive, organized, and ambitious. Its people were known as the people of the river, and rightly so. The empire grew from the city of Gao, stretching outward until it embraced Timbuktu, Djenne, and the arteries of commerce that crisscrossed the Sahel.
In the 15th and 16th centuries, under the leadership of Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad, Songhai became one of the largest empires in African history. But Songhai was not only about territory, it inherited Mali's love of knowledge and expanded it. Timbuktu, already sacred, became even more radiant, its Sankore University housing thousands of manuscripts in science, law, philosophy, and theology. Students came from across Africa to learn beneath its domes, where books were more valuable than gold, and where thought was a form of worship. Both Mali and Songhai understood that empire was not measured by armies alone. It was measured by what was remembered, what was taught, what was passed from generation to generation. In their courts, scribes held power. In their markets, ideas were traded alongside salt. And in their hearts, a spiritual belief thrived. That leadership was not domination, but stewardship. The empires of river and light remind us that Africa's legacy is not just one of kingdoms and conquests, but of cosmic vision and intellectual depth. Their names carry that echo still. Mali, where the king dwelled in balance, and Songhai, the river's children who carried wisdom wherever the current flowed. Before there was Mali, before Ghana stood in golden pride, there was a whisper in the earth, a memory molded in clay and forged in fire. That whisper was Nok. Tucked within the central valleys of what we now call Nigeria, the Jos Plateau, the Kaduna Plains, and the Benue Basin, Nok civilization emerged as one of Africa's oldest and most mysterious cultures. Its timeline, stretching from around 1500 BCE to 300 CE, predates the great empires of West Africa by 1,000 years. But Nok left no palaces, no towering walls, no libraries of scrolls. What it left was art, soulful, expressive, and undeniable. What it left was fire, smelting iron long before Europe's Iron Age would ignite. Nok was not the beginning of African civilization, but it was one of its earliest clear voices, and that voice was sculpted, not written. From the red soils of the Nok region have emerged thousands of terracotta figures, each one a window into the inner life of a people who understood form, emotion, and spiritual depths with stunning clarity. These were not simple idols or decorative ornaments. They were ancestral portraits, deified beings, symbolic dreamers. Their eyes, often wide and hollow, seem to stare directly into us across time, challenging the idea that early Africans lived in cultural silence. The details are exquisite. Braided hairstyles, intricate jewelry, stoic postures, animals by their sides, all captured in baked clay over 2,000 years ago. Each sculpture tells a story of status, mythology, or memory. In Nok, clay spoke before writing. Where there were no alphabets, there was still expression. Where there was no parchment, there was still permanence. The artistry was so advanced, so spiritually rich, that modern scholars still debate its exact meanings. Yet one thing is clear. These works were made by a people who saw the human form as sacred, and who saw their land not as wilderness, but as canvas. Even more astonishing is what Nok achieved in metallurgy. At a time when many regions of the world were still living in the Stone Age, Nok had already begun smelting iron at sites like Taruga, one of the earliest known locations of iron production in sub-Saharan Africa. Here, fire did more than provide warmth. It shaped tools, weapons, and culture. Iron wasn't just survival, it was transformation. The ability to manipulate metal meant Nok people could clear forests, shape landscapes, and build lives of complexity and resilience. In this way, fire taught before books. This iron mastery wasn't an isolated phenomenon. Its legacy traveled. Through trade, migration, and cultural osmosis, the technological and artistic DNA of Nok spread far and wide. You can see Nok's fingerprints in the bronze artistry of Ife, in the divine city planning of Benin, and in the ritual relics of Igbo Ukwu. These later civilizations carried Nok's spirit forward, evolving it, refining it, but never forgetting its roots. Nok was a seed planted deep in the soil of time, and it blossomed across centuries of African creativity. Yet, for all its influence, Nok remains shrouded in mystery. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't have their written words. But through the art, we know they believed in the sacredness of life, the power of image, and the eternal bond between memory and matter. They turned earth into spirit, and spirit into legacy. In Nok, clay spoke before writing. Fire taught before books. It was Africa's first memory. Nok reminds us that even in silence, a culture can speak. Even without monuments, greatness can endure. And that the beginnings of African civilization are not found in colonial timelines, but in the hearts and hands of its first visionaries. And from that fire came the kingdoms that still carry its echo. The kingdoms of Mali, of Benin, of Ife, and beyond. They did not emerge from nowhere. They rose from this ancestral furnace, sculpted by time, carried by memory, ignited by Nok. Nok was not forgotten. It was remembered forward. Nigeria is a name that, like so many others in Africa, did not come from the land it was given to. It did not rise from its rivers or emerge from the lips of its elders. It was spoken by someone who did not belong to it. Flora Shaw, a British journalist and colonial administrator. In 1897, as Britain expanded its grip over West Africa, she coined the term Nigeria in an article, choosing it for convenience, brevity, and imperial order. The name was derived from the Niger River, a waterway that snakes through West Africa like a central vein. And just like that, a land of hundreds of cultures, languages, kingdoms, and sacred traditions was renamed with one foreign word. But names, as we know, are never neutral. To name something is to claim it. To rename something is to rewrite its memory. Before Nigeria, there were many nations, each with its own cosmology, its own understanding of place and self. The land now called Nigeria was not a singular entity, but a complex, interconnected mosaic of civilizations. It was a chorus of names, each one resonating with ancestral power. In the southwest, where the Yoruba people trace their lineage to the mythical city of Ile-Ife, the land was known as Ile-Omo Oduduwa, the land of the children of Oduduwa. Oduduwe in Yoruba cosmology is the divine progenitor of the Yoruba people, said to have descended from the heavens to establish order in the world. This was more than myth. It was geography as spirituality. The land was not just land. It was inheritance, sacred ground, walked by deities and crowned with ritual. Towns like Oyo, Ibadan, and Ife were part of a sophisticated system of governance, diplomacy, and divine kingship, long before colonial forces arrived. To live in Ile-Omo Oduduwa was to live in a sacred narrative. To the south, the Benin Kingdom flourished, one of Africa's most artistically advanced and politically organized empires. Its people referred to their capital as Lu-Edo or Edo Nevbo Ahire, meaning the city of prosperity and love. The city of Benin was famous for its urban planning, earthworks, and bronzes. Each piece a living map of royal lineage, cosmology, and divine order. The Oba, or king, ruled not merely as a monarch, but as a priest-king, bridging the spiritual and political worlds. The walls of Benin City stretched for hundreds of kilometers, a feat of engineering rivaling any in the world at the time. When European explorers first encountered Benin, they were awestruck by its sophistication. Yet, centuries later, the name would be reduced to a mere province, and then rewritten as part of a Nigeria that never asked for its voice. In the East, the Igbo territories thrived in decentralized but deeply spiritual communities. The land was known as Ala Igbo, the sacred land of the Igbo. Here, governance was guided not by kings, but by councils of elders, priests, and market women. The Allah, or earth goddess, was central to Igbo cosmology. She was the source of morality, fertility, and balance. Every piece of land belonged to the lineage. Every grove had a guardian spirit. Villages like Nuri, one of the oldest known Igbo settlements, were spiritual centers where kings were ritually cleansed and peace was mediated through ancestral law. Ala Igbo was not a passive land, it was a participant in the life of its people. And these are just three of many. Beyond them were the Kanem-Bornu Empire in the northeast, the Nupe and Jukun states in the Middle Belt, and countless others, each with their own systems of trade, governance, and spiritual geography. The Hausa states with cities like Kano, Katsina, and Zaria were linked by long-standing trade routes that stretched deep into the Sahara and beyond. Their land had names rooted in Islam, history, and regional pride. Names that told of emirs, scholars, and warriors. So when Nigeria was imposed, it was not a name, it was a silencing. It took 1,000 tongues and offered one. It erased sacred geographies and replaced them with administrative zones. The people of Ile Omo Oduduwa, Ilu Edo, and Ala Igbo were now all called Nigerians, a term with no roots in their soil. But the memory of the old names never disappeared. They lived on in proverbs, in oriki, praise poetry, in naming ceremonies and rituals. They echoed in songs sung at twilight, in libations poured for ancestors, in the quiet knowledge passed from elder to child. Even today, when someone calls themselves Omo Oduduwa or speaks of Ala Igbo with reverence, they are resisting forgetting. They are saying, we remember who we were before the name. Nigeria was not one name, it was a chorus. Each voice carried its own rhythm, its own story, its own truth. And though the world may know only the name that came from outside, those who listen closely can still hear the music of the many names that came before. Where the Atlantic kisses the western edge of Africa, two nations sit like twins divided by history, Senegal and the Gambia. To modern eyes, they appear as separate states, one embracing the coast, the other curled like a ribbon around a river. But this division is a recent scar. Before colonization drew the lines, this region was a continuous cultural, spiritual, and economic zone, bound not by borders, but by water. The land we now call Senegal was once known among its Wolof-speaking people as Sunugal, meaning our boat. It was more than a name, it was a worldview. The boat symbolized unity, shared destiny, and movement across waters. In Sunugal, rivers were not barriers, they were bridges. Communities flowed with the tide, living in harmony with the rhythms of the sea and the seasons. Fishermen, traders, griots, and warriors all moved from delta to desert, bringing not only goods, but stories, memories, and messages. The word Senegal, as it entered European maps, likely grew from this very word, Sunugal. Portuguese and French explorers, hearing it repeated along the coast, recorded it not as a phrase of unity, but as a place to claim. Over time, the name was fixed on paper, its meaning forgotten by those who wrote it, but not by those who lived it. To the people of Senegal, the water has always meant more than trade. It was history, ancestry, connection. Just south of Senegal lies the Gambia, a nation defined almost entirely by its river. The Gambia River, winding deep into the continent, is one of Africa's oldest arteries of commerce and culture. But before the Gambia was marked out by British ink in the 19th century, it was not a country. It was a corridor. The lands along its banks were known by older indigenous names, Kombo, Badibu, Niumi, regions with their own chiefs, languages, spiritual practices, and trade networks. These areas were part of a larger system long before colonialism. Mandinka merchants navigated the river, connecting inland savannas to the Atlantic coast. Islamic scholars taught in riverine villages, Traditional healers drew water from sacred bends in the river. To name this entire landscape the Gambia as if it were a singular unit was to flatten a rich complexity. The artificial boundary that now separates Senegal from the Gambia was not drawn by the people. It was the result of imperial compromise. A line carved between France and Britain during the colonial era, splitting families, tribes, and trade routes. But the river never obeyed this logic. It continued to flow, carrying memory from one bank to the other, as it always had. Even today, you can hear the same music, taste the same dishes, and speak the same languages on both sides of the border. The water carried memory and returned it. The Atlantic, often remembered as a symbol of slavery and separation, also holds stories of return. In both Senegal and the Gambia, ports like Gore Island and James Island are marked by pain, places where millions were taken from their homelands, never to return. But those waters also carried whispers of resistance. They carried prayers. They carried the names of home. And today, descendants of those taken return to these shores, searching for the names, the languages, and the stories that were lost. In that return, Sunugal, our boat, becomes more than a memory. It becomes a promise. Senegal and the Gambia were not born from Europe's pen. They were shaped by tides, by the songs of fishermen, by the echoes of griots under moonlight. The river remembers even when we forget. And through that remembrance, a new generation is learning how to listen again. Not to the borders, but to the water song. In what is now the Republic of Benin, there once rose a kingdom founded in cosmology, protected by warriors and named with reverence, Dahomey. Its name came from the Fon language, Danxome, meaning in the belly of dawn. Dan was not a person. He was a serpent deity of creation in Vodun tradition, the coiling force that held the world together. To say the palace was in the belly of Dan was to root the state in the divine. Dahomey wasn't just a kingdom. It was a spiritual vessel, a manifestation of cosmic balance. Its rulers, beginning with King Haweg-Baja and expanding under powerful leaders like King Gezo and King Behanzin, ruled with both political command and ritual obligation. They were custodians of the sacred. The capital, Dahomey, was more than a royal seat. It was a ritual archive. Palace walls were etched with bas-reliefs telling stories of kings, wars, creation, and divine mandate. These visuals were not ornamental. They were sacred records, preserving memory in form and symbol. Dahomey is also known for the Agoji, the all-female royal guard often referred to as the Amazons. These women were warriors, yes, but also priestesses, enforcers of spiritual law, and protectors of the cosmic order embodied by the king. To be an Agoji was to embody the ancestral wrath and wisdom of the land itself. But as the French colonial empire closed in, Dahomey was forcefully absorbed into a foreign framework. Its rituals were suppressed, its palace sacked, and its name repackaged. In 1975, the modern nation-state once called Dahomey renamed itself the Republic of Benin, not in reference to the Dahomey legacy, but in an effort to adopt a broader pre-colonial reference. Ironically, the name Benin was taken from the Benin Kingdom in Nigeria, not from any territory that ever belonged to Dahomey. Every name held energy. To rename was to silence the gods. Dahomey's true name, Danxome, was more than a title. It was a declaration that the king sat in the belly of the divine and that the people walked within a sacred rhythm. Today, Dahomey still holds that pose. Its shrines remain. Its memory resists. And the spirit of Dan still coils beneath the soil, waiting to be heard again. On the far western edge of Africa, where the ocean breathes against the shore and memory rides the tide, lie two nations with stories unlike any other, Sierra Leone and Liberia. Both lands were envisioned as sanctuaries of freedom. Both emerged in the shadow of the Atlantic slave trade. And yet, even in the story of return, there was forgetting. Sierra Leone bears a name given not by its own people but by Portuguese explorers. In the 15th century, a sailor named Pedro de Sintra arrived on its shores and, inspired by the rugged hills rising inland, called it Serra Leoa, Lion Mountains. The name evoked strength, majesty, and presence, qualities he perhaps saw in the dramatic landscape. Over time, Serra Leoa became Sierra Leone, a name that stuck, spreading across maps and treaties, cemented into colonial memory. But the land itself already had names. The Mende and Temne peoples, whose ancestors had lived there for generations, called their regions by other terms, names rooted in lineage, landmarks, and local cosmology. These names were not unified under one nation, but reflected a mosaic of communities with their own languages, sacred sites, and ways of life. Mountains were not just physical features. They were homes to spirits. Rivers were not simply routes. They were relatives. When British colonizers later declared Freetown a settlement for freed slaves in the late 18th century, they viewed the region as a blank canvas. But it wasn't. It was already inscribed with culture and memory. The freed slaves who arrived, many of whom were from the Caribbean or previously enslaved in North America, brought with them a different set of names, faiths, and aspirations. They sought to rebuild lives on African soil, but the soil they returned to was not a void. It had its own heartbeat. Across the border, Liberia tells another powerful story, one of Black return and Black republic. The name Liberia, meaning Land of Liberty, was chosen by the American Colonization Society, which helped to resettle formerly enslaved African Americans on the West African coast in the 1800s. The capital, Monrovia, was named after US President James Monroe. It was meant to be a beacon, a place where Black people, free at last, could govern themselves and create a nation untouched by white supremacy. But even in this story of return, something ancient was obscured. Long before the settlers arrived, the land had its own inhabitants. The Bassa, Vai, Kru, Grebo, Gola, and many others. These communities had systems of governance, spiritual traditions, oral histories, and sacred names for their territories. They did not call the land Liberia. They did not recognize Monrovia. To them, these were new names laid over older truths. The tension between the returning settlers and the indigenous peoples of Liberia shaped the country's history. It was a meeting of diasporas, those who had left and those who had never left. And while Liberia became the first African republic, a symbol of Black independence, it also inherited the colonial impulse to rename, to centralize, to redefine land through foreign eyes. Even if those eyes were African in ancestry, even the return carried echoes of older names. These two nations, Sierra Leone and Liberia, are rich with dualities. They are places of profound freedom and deep forgetting. They are homelands and adopted homes. They are ancient and modern, rooted and transplanted. The names tell only part of the story. Beneath Sierra Leone are the whispers of Temne kings and Mende priestesses. Beneath Liberia are the chants of Bassa, elders and vice scribes who wrote in one of Africa's few indigenous scripts. These stories are not gone. They are simply buried under layers of hope, trauma, and change. At the edge of return, memory becomes a compass. And the task of our time is not only to honor the freedom gained, but to remember the names that came before it, to speak them, to record them, to lift them from the soil so that they too may breathe again. A name is more than a sound. It is soul, history, belonging. It holds the memory of a people, the map of their becoming, the echo of their ancestors. To name is to give meaning. To be named is to be known. And to To erase is to break a sacred thread that binds identity to origin. Throughout West Africa, we have walked the trail of forgotten names. From Wagadu to Mali, Ubinu to Danxome, Ile Omo, Oduduwa to Ala Igbo, Sunugal to Kombo. These names were not lost. They were buried, silenced, hidden beneath the weight of empire and maps that favored order over truth. But they are still there, waiting. And remembering them is not just about knowledge. It is about power. Colonizers knew that to control a land, one must first control its name. To rename is to reorder reality, to overwrite spiritual geography with imperial grammar. This was not just administrative, it was psychological warfare. But names have memory, and memory is resilient. To rename is to rewrite the soul. To remember is to restore the world. As we remember, we begin to rebuild what was fractured. We recover the dignity that was suppressed, the pride that was hidden, and the stories that were pushed to the margins. Every indigenous name we speak aloud is a form of resistance. Every ancestral word we reclaim is a form of healing. Imagine now a map not colored by colonial borders, but by ancestral memory. Montage. Ancient names glowing softly where nations once were. Kumbisale, Manden, Ife, Ubinu, Ala Igbo, Sunugal, Danxome, flowing across the land like sacred inscriptions. As the colonial names fade, the ancestral ones rise. The map breathes again. Africa did not wait to be discovered. She was already awake. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a return to memory, to meaning, to ourselves. Like this video to honor what was hidden. Comment. We remember their names. Subscribe to History Store for more untold African stories, because the land remembers. And now, we do too.